Welcome back to you as well. Thank you for persevering. We ended with sometimes in questions, and what we did in the morning was really look at what's the threshold that beckons us into the life, and to be attentive to that moment in our own lives, knowing its moment is a figurative term. It's a space and time. And now where we are is looking at ourselves on the threshold. So, and saying, what's there? What's there that can both feed us? What is there that will test us and challenge us? And I have a sense that our newer members regularly invite us to places that can move us to thresholds. See, they come humanly with their own baggage like the rest of us to religious life with fresh eyes, and having just crossed the threshold of their own with desire and freedom and hopes. They come to you and our congregations because they see a common vision and hope and have joined their hopes with ours. So threshold questions are actually very familiar and even welcome to them. So do continue to invite their voices. As Carolyn was saying, how do you bring this younger and newer generation forth? So we find ourselves at these thresholds, these sacred moments, and they do require both reverence and awareness from us. Okay? If a threshold is a significant experience, frontier, where experience banks up, where there's an intense concrescence, what do we find at this threshold? Now, each of us and also our congregations are distinct. So I invite you to see where you and your congregation fit here. And you may find some of what's across the threshold, what you've been experiencing. So allow those to be malleable and see where you are in those. I offer that at the thresholds we find the following gifts. One is the invitations from the many. Another is communal discernment. 3, disponibilidad. And 4, some tests, temptations, or risks. So at the thresholds we find these many questions. We have to sift and sort them like chaff from husk. And we bring who we are and who we are becoming to these questions at the threshold. So first, at the threshold we find invitations, calls, cries from the many. Here we must be attentive and listen deeply. Not only the Millennium Development Goals, but the subject of the Millennium Development Goals. People who embody these efforts and cries. The hungry, those without education or health care, women, children. Our creation cries out in the midst of pollution and abuse and misuse. In this nation, the immigrant communities cry out. Our cities and rural areas cry out. Our world cries out in disease, in the dis-ease with which governments can rule or legislate and care for the common, and particularly the increasingly common poor and marginalized. Our spiritual hungers cry out. Hungers for meaning, for belonging, for a table of welcome, for a way to participate at the table. We hear the cries for justice, for peace, for a way of living and believing that makes a difference for good in this world and universe. This is the world you travel in, I know that. To be noted here is that while some at times will find this overwhelming, there are always some, and often our newer members, who will find this call an opportunity to love more deeply, who will see possibility and hope when some will not. That's again why we do this as a community. Also, among the invitations from the many, we must note and hear that the cries may also be within our own houses, communities, and even congregations. Within communities, we may hear the cry for deeper meaning, for deeper and life-generating living, and we struggle to do this. We hear from some of our newest or newer members, how can I live more deeply than I already did before I entered? Is there anything different in my life? When the world seeks separation and isolation, and the call they hear from God in community is communion and depth and breadth, how might we come to know each other at the depths of our being so that we more and more transparently bring the presence of God, who is hope, to those spaces that need hope? To the marketplace, to the barrio, to the hospital, the school, our homes, our communities. Note, they may not do it any better than any one of us, but their longing is great. How do we attend to the life as we do the necessary reconfiguring for mission? There is a reason that with Giving Voice, this year's national conference in Milwaukee is going to take up the topic of community for mission. It's a deep cry from some of the newer and younger members as they too seek to live more deeply the life which God calls all of us to. Do you hear some of these questions as well? The invitations from the many call us, and we must come together and respond. Coming to the threshold, we realize that what has been is not enough anymore. At the threshold, we realize we cannot do this alone. We find ourselves together, or at least call ourselves together, to the threshold. Remember, the threshold is not the vision, but it invites us to the wider vision. Even as we may not see it on the threshold, it will beckon. This brings us to the second gift of the threshold, communal discernment. The invitations to us as religious men and women today are certainly communal. The invitation is such. How we respond must come most deeply from who we are as men religious, as women religious. In communal discernment, we consider our identity and role today, the signs of the times, what is offered, what it would take. We make choices and even sacrifices. Communal discernment also asks for our time, for that communal contemplation, for prayer, for creativity to have space to be awakened, for possibilitizing, prioritizing, and decision-making. At the threshold, communal discernment is necessary. How do we discern together? Beyond chapters, though chapters are certainly essential. In the midst of discernment, our deepest values, hopes, priorities, identities are named, and what is no longer the deepest value or priority or keenest identity is gently let go. Remember that the threshold is a powerful time, a transformative time, and only what is most essential is to stay. The rest, held lightly or even let go, frees us to deeply hear and respond. We certainly do this individually. We must also do this communally. Each congregation will do this in their own spirit. We hear from Benedictine Sister Christine Vladimiroff a reminder of that importance of community. I quote, "When we can clearly articulate who we are in the world and how we are gift to our church, then we can move with confidence into that future that is hope-filled. This will also suggest to us," it's still the quote, "this will also suggest to us the areas of our lives as individuals and as community that must change, that must be transformed for us to become a declaration of God's reign," unquote. She also reminds us that, quote, "life in community and our sense of mission as service for others comes out of our discipleship, following the Christ. Together, they are our essential witness to the church and to the world." What community offers at this moment also is powerful creativity. I'll touch on this a bit more in our next movement, but for now I offer an insight from Peter Senge, author of Presence in Organizational Learning work. He says, quote, "Only the creating mode leads to a genuine sense of individual and collective power, because only in the creating mode do people orient themselves to their intrinsic desires." Interesting, isn't it? There's much potential here, and again, it comes from a sense of deep listening of what is in the world, in the church, and within our congregational lives. And if you would allow me now for a few moments to concretize this a bit, this example of the communal threshold moment taken by the Baltimore Nuns of Carmel. And you may have a plethora of further examples, and I invite you to bring those forth too. Some of these quotations are from the National Religious Retirement Office that coordinated a DVD called A Future Full of Hope. And it's coordinated by Sister Janice Bader. Some years ago, the Carmelite community looked at itself and saw what they were doing and being, and it was good. They looked at who they were and were satisfied. They also saw that they had not had anyone entering for some years now, or at least if people were entering, no one was staying. Connie Fitzgerald, the Carmelite sister, who's a wonderful scholar on the mystics, particularly John of the Cross, was their prioress at that time. And she says that we knew we would still be alive for some years and decades. This wasn't an immediate issue, but our time would end. She says, quote, "We have only a window of 5 to 10 years, and if we don't profit by this time, we'll die. We have survived, though, for 214 years, and we're not willing to die now." And the piece about dying was, she said, if we have, at a certain point, if we don't have people coming in, or if we wait too long, those of us who have the gifts for formation will no longer be able to do that. So they were really looking at who they were and where they were. And she says, our Carmelite heritage dates back to John of the Cross, Teresa of O.S.U, and Teresa of Avila. It's time to get moving. I didn't quote her there. She says they also looked at their world today and saw that what they offer is still very important. A contemplative way of looking and being in the world. In fact, that it's ever more important today. They found themselves realizing a need to offer a contemporary experience of the contemplative life. So they said, what do we offer and what does the world need? You know what, we have it. We're going to have to name it in this time that it's in. This is a threshold moment for them. And so there was a value to them to continuing the life, not for their own sake, but because the life had so much to offer the world and church, and the Spirit was clearly saying this to them. And this, by the way, came from a number of discussions. It happened even over the course of years. Okay? And so Carmelites live together, that group does, and so this may seem easier because of their lives. At the same time, she's going to tell you it's not easy, and every place will have to make its choices. And one of the gifts, she said, that their community has is the gift of communal dreaming, to be able to really ask in a wonderment way, I wonder what it might be like if. I wonder. And dream they did. They also realized their dreams, and it took hard work, and they knew not every dream would make it to fruition either. So they saw who they were, they knew their identity, they said they still had something crucial to offer the church and world, and then each woman in the congregation was asked what she felt she could offer a newer member. From the oldest in her 80s to the newest and youngest who is not yet finally professed, each woman was asked personally, what could you offer? They looked at these signs of the times, and one of the things she talks about is that they really went through a conversion in the midst of this process. Okay? What they saw was women who were also looking for community as a framework for their life. Now note, this did not become a tension between ministry and community. At times I think we do that it's about this or about that. Our lives need that flow of prayer, community, ministry. All of those pieces are part of God's mission in there, and all is integrated. So they listened to the signs of the times and responded. Right? And so I'm offering a few quotes here. One, women coming to religious life today, and this is from Connie, want above all communities of prayer who are truly communities. They are by and large talented, educated women who have had a career before they came to us. They can live a ministerial life without entering a community. They can even serve the poor. They can be in social work. They can be a lawyer who is out looking out for the immigrant and the oppressed. They can do all of these as laywomen not in religious life. Continued the quote, there has to be a reason to enter religious life. And one of the reasons I have discovered is community. And I think all of our communities of religious women, religious men as well, actually are going to have to provide a very deep community life for sisters. And the crux of this is that it's going to call for sacrifices. And sacrificing things that we may legitimately have, not things that are wrong for us to have. Yet we're going to have to be on call to mentor these women, to provide a model for them how the life needs to be lived. And unless communities can offer this, they are not going to have and keep new women, unquote. This you know, don't you? Another quote, at some point, she says, a realization came that if they were to welcome women today to the Carmelite life, they too would have to adapt and shift some of their lives in order to welcome women. They crossed more than one threshold here, I'd say. But important to note is that the life in God and what God's call was to them was the key factor. The rest of the pieces could shift. At one point, Connie offered some interesting and perhaps provocative observations when she looked at this time and also looked at Vatican II. And I know you had some of these questions in conversation, so I'm going to quote Connie on how do we look at this time and how do we look at Vatican II. I was born at the end of Vatican II, and I teach Catholic social thought. So I'm teaching what's in Vatican II and what came before it and what came after it. So how do we put this in proper perspective? I quote her. She says, I think many communities have not yet calculated the cost of new membership. It's my belief that the time of renewal after Vatican II is over. It is completed, and we are in a new era and a new time of renewal, and this time of renewal calls for different gifts and different sacrifices than the previous epoch following Vatican II called for. After Vatican II, we moved into a very vigorous time, and it was a time of the development of our sisters. There was a concentration on self-development, on education, even in a certain way on self-realization, which was prevalent in the whole society. And religious life needed this. There needed to be a shift to a person-centered kind of life, away from something that was strictly structure-centered. And that whole time for renewal called for new things in that time. And life is developed out of what we did at that time. There were good things that were necessary. I think that this time we are in now is calling for different gifts. It is my belief that we have to come to new terms with this new time and with what it asks of us. Because if we are to have new people in our community, it will demand of us real self-sacrifice. Unquote. So you see, that's the way she put it into a perspective of saying, it's part of that piece of it. And we have to also say, yes, Vatican II is an important piece, and so is 2008. And we have to keep reading the signs, just as the people during Vatican II had to read their signs in their times. They don't need to be at opposites with one another. Well, the women took ownership for this process of renewal, and they responded, and probably aware of some of the sacrifices they would have to make, and probably not aware of some of them. In that process, each person sharing what she can offer a woman coming in. The community did go through a profound conversion, she says. And she said, though, it set us up to do and to give what had to be done and what had to be given to help women come to the monastery and also to remain. And she says, and there's a tender moment here, she says, in the process, the sisters have all become the best they can be. And she said that at one of their vow ceremony. You have become at this stage in your life the very best you can be. What tender words. The current prioress also offered an insight. She said, if you're looking at the life, you really have to think in very large terms, because things like feasibility and money and all will catch up with you soon enough, that you have to inject the magic into what you hope for. And she says, I think religious women have to do that to continue their traditions. The people who can do that will go on. I really believe that, she says. Okay? Their new awareness moved something as well. It moved their adapting and prioritizing. And Connie says, I think it's very difficult in a community like ours, which remains together for a lifetime, to integrate new women into the community. She says it's not a lack of willingness, it's a lack of awareness of how hard it is to break into a group that has lived together for 25, 30 years, 40 years, and some of us even 50 years. There's so much give that has to happen if newer people are to find their place. And she says, I think the community became willing to give whatever it took in order to provide new spaces for these younger women. Now, it's one thing to think you're going to do this and to want to do this, and it's quite another thing to do this. She says it's been costly to do this for the community because people who have been in for 30, 40, 50 years, and especially in a contemplative community, can think about times of prolonged solitude. They can think of times of relative peace. But when you bring in 6 new women into the community, things change very much. The community is much more boisterous. The community is, for a time at least, much less solitary. These newer women have emotional needs and even immaturities that the older sisters really don't have in the same way. They're the kinds of self-concern that occupy people who are coming initially to the community. There's an enormous amount of personal investment that need to be provided in order for these people to succeed, to feel that they belong, to feel that they're in their place, their own place. And she says, and what's remarkable is that everyone's done this. And I'll close with this piece from her. She says, I feel very proud of what our sisters have really been able to do. And I think it speaks really of the depth of their own inner life. That in the end, they have known what is really important. And they want people to live this life in the church and in the world. And the contemplative life they know, and we know, all of us do, is very, very important for the church and for the world, unquote. But it's that they knew what was most important for them. Okay? Now this is, again, not to put a simplistic mode on this, because they really worked hard at it, and it took years. But now they do have an intergenerational community and also a multicultural and intercultural community. It's not that theirs is a formula to follow, but note the steps and note the pieces and see what is it that could be inviting some communal discernment. That's their example. Every one of us have our own cultures and communities. But what is it in this that can be brought forth? What might that be inviting us to? That's their communal discernment at the threshold. What's yours? And this kind of communal discernment need not be simply with the congregation. There's a number of ways to use it. There's a group of religious communities who together in the past few years discerned that there's a great need in the Sudan for education. And several religious from various congregations have responded to this call. It's an intercongregational call flowing out of the calls around them and their mission. So the possibilities abound. And yet, again, and you're going to hear it a lot, I know, but communities must communally discern at these thresholds in their time. And the priorities and identities are shaped here. If we can do so in ministry, community, and prayer, listening to the cries around us that we're discerning, and we can come with a contemplative spirit, we'll be met with our third gift at the threshold, disponibilidad. I have found no adequate translation for this from the Spanish, and if our brothers and sisters have an idea, I'm most welcome and appreciative. But we come to the thresholds finally with this attitude, a stance, which is both a practice and a disposition, with the virtue of disponibilidad, radical availability. Meg Geider, a Franciscan, first brought that word to my attention. But it's not just disponible, I'm here, I'm available, but the real sense of radical availability, deep availability, complete availability to God's mission, God's call. Oh, our newer members have much to teach us here. For somewhere in their yes to God's call to religious life, they experience that gift and response of disponibilidad. Didn't you? Didn't we? The invitation continues today. One of my Ursuline sisters in a small group discussion when our congregation was realizing that a direction we were seriously discerning was no longer the direction we were called to, ended up saying at the table, you know what, that's fine. This frees us to deeply listen anew. Over 5 years ago, she said, I let all go and responded to the call. I can continue to do so in freedom. The hope was palpable in the room as we realized one direction was not the Spirit's call and that we were being called anew. And so the listening continues for us in active engagement. The threshold continues to beckon. And a recent insight for me on disponibilidad is actually our sushi pay. Accept me, O God, according to your word, and let me not be confounded in my expectations. There's a beauty to it. It's this stance that helps us cross the threshold. There is that more that we sense calling us. And yet with the 3 we've had so far, we're met with one more set of gifts and their tests. At the threshold, we must be aware of something else that will greet us and ask for attention. Tests, biblically known as temptation. Early in Luke's gospel, we read that it's when Jesus prays, the Spirit comes and he's made ready for mission. And that this theme is repeated in Acts 1 and 2. The community is at prayer. The Spirit comes and the early believers are made ready or bold for mission as Peter rises to preach. So it is with us. Yet there's more, for Luke's account doesn't end with Jesus' prayer and the response of, you are my son, my beloved, with whom I am well pleased. The verses go on. Instead, Jesus, full of the Holy Spirit, returns from the Jordan and then is led by the Spirit into the desert where he is tempted. Scholars remind us that the temptation signals the beginning of the eschatological struggle with evil. That is, anything or anyone who attempts to obstruct Jesus' movement forward in mission in response to God's plan. At the end of this time of testing, Luke clearly says in chapter 4:13 that the struggle is not yet over. Quote, when the devil had finished every test, he departed from him until an opportune time, unquote. Well, this is our experience too. Thresholds evoke voice that remind us of the cost of community, of discipleship, of true obedient listening to the Spirit among us. What comes forth at the thresholds? Tests are inclinations and discernments, so they really are a gift to us. Yes, something new calls us forth. We're at the threshold and we're saying a new energy emerges and we're saying, yes, there's something calling us. Well, so does fear. So does a desire for more security than is our life. Doubts emerge. Questions come forth. And as a community, we must discern the spirits here. In the midst of hope also comes fear. What? We can't do that. What about what we're already doing? That must be our stable commitment. This would ask so much of me. I don't think I can do it. I don't know where this is going. And I can't go until I see it all. I need a blueprint and the ink needs to be dry. What will this cost us financially, people-wise, environmental responsibility-wise, in terms of energy that we have at this time? We've never done it this way. This is asking too much of me. It's just too hard to change. I bet we've all found ourselves here at one time or another. The list continues. My entire schedule would have to shift. How we live, you heard it. How we live local community would require change. I don't have time for this. This is for the next generation to figure out. I don't want to go there. I can't be still. There's too much to be done. The associates will carry this on. And here I do put a note. Don't put the associates in this position. Theirs is not a call to religious life, but to live the charism in their various life commitments and ministry. The list continues. Aren't we already doing good works? I don't want to be uprooted. We don't have time, we don't have money, we don't have energy, Gosh, have you ever found yourself or your congregation going down many roads, feeling like a spinning top or a computer frozen because you tried to keep too many things open and running at the same time? You're the tech age. Disponibilidad, as beautiful as it is, doesn't go down easily, though it does offer us great freedom and responsibility. What do we do in this moment? Where do we go? We have been praying. Well, we go to our stories, our deep stories, ones that speak of who we are. We go to what Johann Baptist Metz calls our dangerous memories of Jesus. We remember the dangerous memories of Scripture. And to this we bring our narratives, our communal stories. In our founders and foundresses, in the history of our congregations, we have these dangerous narratives to share with one another, not as a way of going back, but as a way of sensing the communion of saints we travel with and that invite us forth. This reminds us of where we put our trust. We see our salvation history, and in it all, a God who is faithful to us. This assists us in pulling chaff from wheat and crossing thresholds with some direction, though we'll probably not see very clearly across the horizon until we reach the other side. Remember John O'Donohue's line. But just before we cross the threshold, allow me to say that not everyone may see at the same time, may be able to cross at the same time. This may metaphorically be a several day, week, or month crossing. There is, however, a dynamic of movement, and you do need a critical mass to cross over. Must all cross it? At some point, you hope that all will, but if initially you simply need a critical mass. I don't know what that is for any of our congregations. That's part of your discernment, but you get a sense of that. Of course, the more the better, people committed and moving together, that is community. Someone just off leadership recently shared that for the 10 years she was on leadership, the team was cultivating not only new membership, but also leadership in this new membership. This year, she said she was finally seeing some of the fruits of this in the voices of the newer and younger women. Seeing the energy also connecting with the rest of the generations when they assembled. Their voices and all the voices came together. Differently, but they came. So what can we do here at the crossing? We must remember that hope too is communal. And once we have crossed, we cannot go back. However, we can invite others at the threshold over. We can encourage and help one another because the vision needs and beckons the ones on the threshold too, in freedom. All are in this. This is again where, as O'Donohue writes, quote, "This is where we need to retrieve and reawaken our capacity for blessing. If we approach our decisive thresholds with reverence and attention, the crossing will bring us more than we could have ever hoped for. This is where blessing invokes and awakens every gift the crossing has to offer," unquote. We bring all we have to this moment and then move, walk, journey beyond what we can exactly see, but which we know is deep and true. The threshold invites, and with both trepidation and eagerness, we respond. We seek to respond. Yes, thresholds ask much of us, more than we can even imagine, and offer much, more than we can even imagine. And so for these last moments at the threshold, I invite you to reflect. What threshold beckons your congregation now? What is your participation in this congregational threshold? Your participation. What gifts are present at this threshold moment? And what thresholds beckon you now? For a few minutes, I invite you to just sit with this or write or just be with it. There will be discussion after this next movement, but because you're having break at 2:45, if it's possible to go to 2:45, and then you'll have the long break and then bring the large table. Is that doable? All right, thank you. So what do we find across the threshold? Oh my. The third movement, both promises and possibilities. I offer 4 gifts that we find across the threshold. And remember that some of these you may have found at the threshold, and some of these may have found you across. One is a greater sense of belonging and identity. Next, creativity and imagination. Then community and communion. And finally, globalizing solidarity. Allow me in these last minutes to briefly say something about each. First, a sense of belonging and identity. Across the threshold, we find a greater sense of belonging. We sense that we belong across this threshold. Think of those times you have crossed and you came to know yourself there. You sense you belong across this threshold, even as we may still not know exactly where it would lead. I never said it would offer you that, but you come to it. We have a sense of our deeper belonging in all of creation, and a sense of that identity of knowing what we offer the church and world because of who we are and where we are. Because to cross the threshold, there were things that needed to get let go. Only the essentials come with you across. The Carmelites have this experience. They worked hard to cross that threshold. And identity is forged both in what we hold and what we let go of in order to cross the threshold to the horizons that we start seeing that invite. And in the midst of this, our presence is ever more intentional. As our identity is deepened, so is our public witness. Again, we're reminded by Christine Vladimiroff that life in community and our sense of mission as service for others comes out of our discipleship, following the Christ. Together, they are essential witness to the church and world. This public witness invites us to a transparency that our society struggles against so much. Note our banking crisis and even our earlier sexual abuse charges. Yet our vow of profession is a public ecclesial moment in the church. These vows commit us to a public witness in all. A particularly poignant and powerful example of this for me is about one of my own Ursuline sisters and friend, Anita Whiteley, who for years worked in formation ministry and with the Religious Formation Conference on the board, as well as the conference facilitator. After a battery of tests in August, she was told that she had cancer throughout her system. And in her 60s, and just off 4 years of leadership for our congregation, she made a decision for palliative chemotherapy. She also made a decision to share the news with people publicly. It was on the chain call of our entire congregation, and is very open and welcoming to others. I'm using her as an example, she must be. Allowing others to minister to her instead of what would be understandably pulling in. I commented on this when I saw her in September, and she simply said, "We're called to be public witnesses in all. This is part of that all, to the last breath." So she's teaching all who know her how to live and how to walk across yet another threshold. And it's to her that I dedicate this presentation because of her life and the thresholds she continues to cross, communally as much as individually now. And these too are dangerous memories that move us to greater solidarity and witness. It is to our last breath we vowed a public witness. Second, across the threshold, we find both imagination and creativity further galvanized. Creativity flows out of our deepest desires. We hear from Peter Senge that only the creating mode leads to a genuine sense of individual and collective power, because only in the creating mode do people orient themselves to their intrinsic desires. So whether you did it at the threshold or here, that's a palpable moment. We also know from our own experiences that creativity is a deeply contemplative act, and it moves us to integrate our lives, prayer, community ministry, in essence, mission, again bringing forth our active contemplative dimensions. The religious imagination is a less utilized resource of our tradition than one might think, yet our own founders and foundresses were exceedingly creative and persistent. They found their own resonance with Jesus' proclamation of Isaiah, "I have come to bring release to prisoners," and more. We don't necessarily know how we will do this, but that we must do this is key. And again, we don't do this alone. Our imagination and creativity come forth as we respond to the longings of our world, and often are expressed in our newer members, belonging in the time it takes to get to know one another. Our creative resources are galvanized as we attend to the calls we hear. And we find our imagination engages persons, structures, and systems. That's one of the gifts of our times. We do see the systems at work even as we respond to the individuals in need. God's mission invites a vision beyond our own. All is drenched with possibility. If we can find medicines that can bring people back from the dead with HIV, so much so that it's called the Lazarus effect, we surely bring our 1 million plus religious worldwide and our collaboration with so many to the front of mission efforts. And much happens beyond our expectations. Share some of those stories with one another when you have a chance. All of this is intimately connected to integration, which this age craves and our newer members desire. Third, across the threshold, we find deeper experiences and understandings of communion, of community. Here, phrases such as spirituality of communion or community as a living spirituality of communion takes on more visible flesh. We're hearing this call all over in both church and world, so something is clearly stirring. The 2004 gathering of 980 women and men religious from around the world that evoked a book called Passion for Christ and Passion for Humanity. In the synthesis document in particular, names that communion that people are longing for across all kinds of dimensions. We find this also in the 2002 document, Starting Afresh from Christ, a renewed commitment to consecrated life in the new millennium. The document reminds us that communion and contemplation are necessary for one another, beginning with the communion of friendship with God and overflowing to all. This communion is a sine qua non for consecrated life. And a spirituality of communion, the document says, compels consecrated persons to do all they can to start or continue a dialogue rooted in charity. Is that not what our world needs? On every level, a dialogue rooted in charity on all topics. A commentator and member of the Commission, Charles Mangan, writes that, quote, attempts to spread communion by consecrated men and women are to encompass all people, but especially those who reside in locations oppressed by ethnic hatred or violence. The community mandate is expansive. Fourth, we find across the threshold a greater realization of globalizing solidarity. Once we risk crossing over, how we see the local and the global has implications. While we have no one definition of globalization, we have a sense of it through Bob Schreider's description of it as the increasingly interconnected character of the political, economic, and social life of the peoples of this planet. Our current economic crisis is just one example of where globalization can also do harm, and what happens when the common good, when God's mission is not on the radar screen of decision makers. However, globalization is here to stay. It's in the air we breathe. At the same time, we have some choices in it. It is not an engine that runs without human intervention. And so across the thresholds, we find the wonderful gifts of our brothers and sisters in religious life around the world. They daily remind us of the interconnectedness of our efforts to live the mission of God. Whether more locally based or internationally based, the real question is how we connect globally in vision, mission, and intent. Crossing thresholds will necessarily, and I do mean necessarily, call us to engage our increasingly globalized world and create solidarity in the midst of it. This will mean that we will speak out against all that dehumanizes persons and desecrates creation. Solidarity moves us to what John Paul II described as, quote, globalization without marginalization, or a globalization of solidarity. Solidarity, that walking alongside one another, taking one's cause as one's own, another's cause as one's own, is part of that journey. Knowing God's mission is to be in a globalized world, we respond accordingly, and what happens is often beyond our imaginings. Across thresholds, we do this globalizing solidarity both internationally and intercongregationally. It's interesting that a few years ago at Oblate School of Theology, we had a conference on the environment, and Brian Swim offered 3 lectures. When he began, he said to an audience of about 400 people that he wanted to thank particularly women religious for their pioneer efforts in taking care of the environment. They were among the first in the Christian community to seriously take this on. A facilitator I was in conversation with about a year ago shared that she was working with a group of Dominicans and that Earth had been a focus for them for over 20 years. She said she could understand if the Franciscans were doing this for a long time, but the Dominicans? So she asked a few. The response was quick: Veritas, truth. Truth is the great value to us, and we seek truth in all. So of course it would lead us to looking at the environment. Of course. And not only John Paul II, but also Pope Benedict XVI has been writing a lot in tune with all of this. That solidarity is with all of creation. And globalizing solidarity occurs when we gather together internationally. Every congregation from the local to the international is called to be global today, and each is to name as fully as possible what that means. To simply have members from around the globe is not enough. How is that membership globalizing solidarity within us and around us and through us? One powerful example I experienced of the potential for this was in early September in Ireland with the Presentation Sisters. As an inaugural program, they invited 15 sisters from the entire PBVM family. So it wasn't just international, but it was anyone in the family. To come together for a Horizon program, and they invited the sisters who'd been finally professed 5 to 15 years to apply. Okay? And they had a limited number for their first year. But this group then included sisters from India, Ireland, Pakistan, Australia, Zimbabwe, and the US. I felt like I was in heaven. During my time with them, we spent a week on the vowed life, leaning into it together, seeking to hear and see what God in the midst of all was inviting. Their entire time together is a threshold time. And I could see some of the fruits emerging just as I was there through their third week together. They had 3 more weeks in Ireland, and then finally a month in a country and culture other than their own. And then they would all meet in India for theological reflection on the experiences through an Eastern, through an Asian lens. After this, they were going to be in India for retreat. They wanted to see what happens if we can bring some of these women together and from all over. And the women were leaning deeply and saying, what is the Spirit inviting us to? Okay? And it's a powerful program in there. And they were able to get funding, and they really made commitments to say, how do we find this kind of time? One of the sisters from India, when she got accepted, said, I can't really do this in my ministry. How can I be gone for that long? And one of their wise women said to her, we will have ministry for you, fear not. But this time will shift everything. Will shift, and you will bring that. So it need not be that, but how might we do that globalizing solidarity in our communities? And this isn't only happening here. In a recent chapter, I bet there's a Christian brother or two here, they invited some of their members to come together and together discern what the call is from the Spirit about the way of life to be lived for a Christian brother. The Oblates in the U.S. also invited a few of their members to see the needs of a secular world around them and to discern what way of life and presence is needed today. The limits are only to our creativity, and that's so boundless. Finally, globalizing solidarity is also intercongregational. It's interesting that the Starting Afresh document speaks of not only starting or continuing dialogues, particularly among peoples in conflict, but also to attend to the intra-dimension of their life, and even to create and sustain communion among the various institutes. The document calls for a, quote, joint search for common ways of serving the church, unquote. The acknowledgement of this need and efforts to do more is being publicly witnessed today. A recent example comes from Communal Father Frank Monks, president of the Healthcare Commission of the Superiors General. He says, quote, for us religious, lots of challenges remain in areas like justice, ministry, ethics, and education. This is why we are asked to overcome the fragmentary approach among us so we can speak with one voice and establish a new culture of communion and cooperation, unquote. He saw this as critical, not only for the work of religious, but because their work has implications for everyone else as well. So you bring those people together. And he says there was a recent article that explained that the Superiors General of religious communities are themselves now calling for better teamwork among their congregations so as to make their voices heard in international forums that allot funds to aid and relief projects in the fight against AIDS. So interesting enough, you know, you're aware of how in the past 20 years we've been doing so much in formation ministry, not only intercongregationally, but intercongregationally. You have this, I bet, in many of your cities. The people coming in are being formed with that already. You've given them an invitation, and you're there as well. So, in conclusion, religious life is indeed at a significant threshold moment and moments. And the more familiar and even comfortable we become with them, the better we'll be able to fruitfully respond to the Spirit's call for us in the world. And the sacredness of thresholds is clear. We begin as we conclude with our friend John O'Donohue. If we approach our decisive thresholds with reverence and attention, the crossing will bring us more than we could have ever hoped for. This is where blessing invokes and awakens every gift the crossing has to offer, unquote. So come, my brothers and sisters, let us attend to these inviting thresholds. Amen? Amen. Thank you.
At this time, we'll be taking a break until 3:15. At 3:15, there will be some important announcements, and there will also be conversation with Maria based upon her presentation to us. So we'll see you at 3:15. At this time, we would like to return our attention to Maria's talk on threshold. For the first 5 minutes, we would like to invite you to have some table conversation, to talk about some of the ideas that may have surfaced, some ideas that you would like to share with one another, some questions that you may want to ask during a question and answer period. So about five to 7 minutes, we're going to have some table conversation, and then we'll move into a question and answer period for the remainder of our time. The question, we would like to invite anyone who has a question or comment or reflection that they would like to share with the speaker or with the assembly to approach either of the two microphones on the floor, and we'll begin our question and comment period now. The microphones are open.
My name is Sister Marcy Romine. I'm a Franciscan sister, and I love the image that you brought us as a metaphor of the Carmelite community, which is monastic. We know there are apostolic communities and a new emerging sense of the evangelical life among Franciscans, and I'm assuming Dominicans as well. We're also called to an itinerancy. And we've recently added the word relational itinerancy. How that works, how the idea of the community living or communal life has a different venue among those of us we move from place to place. We don't even have a mother house anymore. We've given it up. So we have a congregational office, and we live among people. Some of us live in convents. In the St. Louis area, we also have the added dimension that, I think it's 3, more than 3 non-related people cannot live in a house. They have to have permission whether you're male or female. So that adds another constraint to living in large houses, which is what, according to what you've said and what we've heard earlier, young people want. So could you kind of break that open a little bit for us?
Wow. I'm grateful you mentioned it at break. Because it's a reality that we're in apostolic, evangelical, monastic, they're different calls. And when you were telling me that itinerancy is one of your calls, I thought, wow, you really could have a move ahead of some of us on disponibilidad, that kind of radical availability of moving to where the unmet need is and the call is. And I do see people want to be part of unmet needs and saying, give me something that's worth everything. I want to give it all away, but I want it to be worth everything. So, then it is saying, all right, now there are different interpretations or translations of community. So you were saying that communal is a word that your community is using more. But yet our conversation was that prayer sharing was of great value. And so people come from different houses and share prayer and share a meal together. It's articulating that, and it's saying, here's how we live in the signs of the times. So looking at, here's our reality in this situation, and also just it's being very aware and articulate about who you are and what that means, and how does that fit into that longing for God, And how do you live that? And how do you live that longing to live that out among and with others? And so the people you minister among and with, but also your sisters, your brothers. And so you get the invitation of creativity and saying, how do we do this? And also saying, what's our value? So, sometimes you can say, okay, what's the value of the people that are looking at religious life? And you say, but our value is not that at all. Well, there either has to be some conversation about that, or you say, that's our reality, and is that your choice too? And so we live with our choices all the time, but saying, we do value that conversation and that sharing, and we make it a point to build community wherever we go. So there are going to be different manifestations of it. And so Connie happened to be one that's I think brought a lot of good points up, but there are lots of ways. And some of you may have some ideas of what do you do? How do you find ways to build community wherever you go? I think it's as creative as the people are here, but thank you for bringing that up, because we're in our different settings. There are Ursuline sisters in China who until they left the country and met for a program never even knew who the other was, and said, how do we do this? So there's so many different contexts that we're living in. Thank you for that. Please.
Father Jim Murphy, Congregation of St. Basil. I'm in Canada. One of the tensions that I have personally, being a Gen Xer, and is the tension at the threshold of I just went through the threshold of that was my formation and entering in and dealing with the struggle that I've gone through the threshold, and now I'm being, as vocation director, but also as a member of the church too. There's a feeling that's partly that I know is a personal hang-up, but also somewhat realistic, that already my generation is seen as obsolete.
No.
Just in terms of with the the millennials, because there is a strong difference between my religious upbringing and that which I'm being asked to bring into the community. And I recognize my own hang-ups, but also how do you reconcile the individual threshold with the communal threshold and the church's the universal church threshold?
Leave it to a Gen Xer to ask that question. Thank you. The first part, and I don't know that I'll be able to address all the pieces, but the first part about there's more than one generation. That's true with Giving Voice. It used to be GVG, to shorten it, the Giving Voice generation. And it was very clear it's the Giving Voice generations. So we have 20s, 30s, 40s, and there is a difference in there. And I think there's that sense of doing some mentoring and accompaniment, but also letting the voices come forth. And as a vocation minister, you do put on a different space. And one of the things I laughed at in Ireland at one point, the sisters, who the vast majority of this group were between the ages of 35 and 48, but at one point they started talking about the younger ones, and they don't have the same education, the same discipline, and I started laughing. I said, they were saying that about you 20 years ago too. We always have the sense of that next generation doesn't quite meet it. But there are going to be differences, and I think it's acknowledging that. So just as a Gen Xer, you're up near the boomers. I mean, those are very different generations too, and even when you look politically and otherwise. So there's just different interests. The personal threshold and the communal, we continue to bring who we are where we go, and part of any kind of commitment means that I will also go where you go, but in who I am. So I would hope that as who you are, you're bringing that that reflective spirit that comes from you to the space. Now, you may also be a minority in that group. So, those of us under 50 are generally a minority in our congregations. And so it is looking at that. And now how do you look at the different thresholds? It's always going to be some kind of balancing intention, because we don't all grow in the same places. But there's also that sense that all I can do is offer who I am at this point and keep offering, what I see, and really trying to listen to what is being said around me as well. It's a challenge, and when you look at it and say, well, here's the church, well, that's a wide open piece, because, which church, what church, and are we talking about, local church or how? But it's saying, what happens when I'm in a different place than my congregation, and I see, gosh, there's such a need for movement. It was Christine Vladimir who came and spoke a couple years ago to one of our Giving Voice conferences. And we had under 50 speak, and then we had our wisdom figures that were 50 and over speaking as respondents. And one of the things Christine did that was really beautiful, because there were some people, she said, I'm hearing sometimes you're saying, Vatican II, and like, get over your anger and things like that. And she said, I just need to explain something to you. And she did it beautifully. It was just a 2-page piece, and it might be on some of our Giving Voice. We can probably make that available. But she talked about what it meant for her community at the dawning and through Vatican II to continue to move. And she said, one of the things you learned was that some were going to run way ahead, and those who ran really fast were going to have to slow up a little bit. And those who were really lagging behind were going to have to step up a little bit more too. For them, it was so important to have community, to keep the unity, that they were willing to work with those kinds of tensions and say, what does that mean? And she did it beautifully, because I don't think we need the tensions that at times get created in there and say, well, it's either this or that. But it was really understanding. And she talked about, what she saw in Vatican II and the beauty of it and how much was moving and changing. And the majority of people there weren't around for Vatican II. So, and I don't mean it to be a history, but it was saying, what was it like? Because you can read the documents. I teach the documents, but there's something else when someone enfleshes it. And she really did, and talked about, we saw so much for you, our daughters. And we don't know if that will be here in our lifetime. So she just saw so much movement and things like that. And it was just very gently done. And so I think it is going to be that tension of those, in our communities who just see it and say, let's get over that threshold. And somebody else saying, I'm just not sure. And at some point we have to make a decision. Because it's like you hit a point, I'm trying to think of images, it's like a skater being ready to perform, having done all the training and waiting for the music to start. You can only stay in this kind of place for so long at some point, and then the music has to move the dancer. And so it is going to be constantly having that. But I think if we have the conversations, it can at least help. To say, I need to tell you, here's my restlessness. And I also need to say my voice comes here, and granted I'm in this age group, and now we have the 20s here, but you really need all of them. You need all of them. And sometimes I think there's been a lack, because there's been a generation that hasn't, the numbers have shifted, and so you do end up caring a little bit more and saying, okay, now what does that mean? Thanks for saying that, though. I don't think you're alone in that.
And I just wanted to comment on that
Please.
question also, that I think what I noticed is the shift that instead of being in a sort of a competition, that we're learning that it's not a competition anymore, that it's about being with each other. And we were just having a discussion the other night in which we were talking about, at times you could feel there's a certain competition that goes on between the generations, especially like Gen X and the generations right above, the boomers and all those folks, that's difficult. And that's one of the things that we've found in Giving Voice, is that we're really trying to create a space where it's not competition, where we're able to take the gift of each and say, wow, what is this saying to religious life and to our world? And I think that's a huge shift as well. It's a total consciousness shift.
Mm-hmm. And that sense of welcoming. I know when there was it might have been in 2003, there was a gathering, a think tank for what became the Giving Voice core team. And at one point there was someone who said, and she said it in a small table, in my community, we wear the habit. And I would have felt you would have judged me if I would have come in my habit. And you would have thought these things and these things. And we made it a point right then and there to say, we're not going to do that. We want the people, and that's a particular group, the 50s and under. We want everyone in this conversation and to feel welcome in it. And let's talk about the things we need to talk about and stay at the table. Wars start because we leave the tables. Please.
My name is Anita Karowski, and I'm a candidate with the Sisters of St. Joseph of Rochester, New York, which is in Region 2. And the response... Thank you. And...
Looks like no more questions. Oh, there's someone coming in. While he's coming up, a few people have been asking about the music we played, that was played. It's, and I think Kristen's going to put it on the PowerPoint, but it's Keith Duke is the composer, musician, and the CD is called Sacred Weave. And you can see that on the board. So we're trying to listen. And it's difficult to find sometimes, so you really have to go looking for the producer of it, but it comes from the UK. But the whole CD is absolutely beautiful. It's steeping.
Steve with Glen Mary, Region 5. You paint a beautiful idea if you cross a threshold and you receive all this belonging, imagination, and creativity. However, I can think of one very concrete example in our community where we discerned, we crossed the threshold, and we found that belonging became confused. So it created just the opposite. So if you can comment, the result doesn't always follow as you said. So can you kind of comment on that other side of crossing the threshold, but seeing a different result than expected?
Absolutely. We don't know what we see, and in some ways, going across the threshold, we use whatever lights we have. And there, I do mean that very prayerfully and in great discernment. When you think of our community stories, where people said, we're going to start a foundation here, all the signs were right, and you get there, and it did not work. It wasn't the place. And so that will happen as well. But it doesn't mean that we don't learn something as we've crossed it, because by going over, you can't go back. And so you can say, well, how do I live with this? But it's always going to say, what am I seeing? What am I seeing across that? I think of, the Jesus story. And so certainly Jesus crossed a variety of thresholds, and on one level his life was a failure. I mean, he died on a cross. And I'm not glorifying that at all in this way, but it is, we don't know where it's going to take us. We don't know the costs. And at times it will take a lot from us. But that is where we go at it in faith and hope. And so that will be, we come with clay feet in this as well and say, what is it? And I'm trying to stay attuned. But it's as, probably our youngest member was just saying, it is that listening and saying, you got her in this place. What is that invitation? And at times it is, one of the things that John O'Donohue says is that you may also suffer some profound loss in there because you lose some of what you have. So it is, any major decision is going to offer that. And it is to say that, all right, we're a community, what is this inviting us to next? So, but you're right, I don't mean to make it an idealistic picture and everything is right. The gift of testing and temptation is also a challenge that goes with that. And so creativity, we can't take on every creative idea, and so there's the culling from that. But you're right, it's saying I'm going with all that we could know at this moment. And we go forth as we can. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can I just,
Oh, please.
yeah, I just want to add this little example of
Great.
a threshold where we went through it and didn't know what it would look like on the other side. And it occurred to me, I'm Cheryl Rose, Sister of the Humility of Mary from Cleveland, Ohio. And probably about 15 years ago, we started a volunteer program, primarily post-college students who give a year of service or however much service they want to give. And we have sort of a formation program for the year-long volunteers. And we always say to them, wherever you go, we go. Wherever you are part of our community. You are our hands and feet. Well, they really believe this. And now, we had one young woman who volunteered for a year, maybe two, and discerned for about a year, thinking about religious life, and she fell in love and got married. And but they're coming to gatherings that we're having, and they're saying things like, I have found my religious community, but I'm getting married. This same young woman said, when you're gone, I'll be there at the villa. I am with this group for the rest of my life, but I'm married. Another one said, I want a pin. We should have a pin. We are part of the community. Another one said, we are your vocations from the 50s and 60s. What do you have for us? So that threshold has left us with some challenges.
And it will, because we again can't see it clearly. When you're on the other side, you're saying, wow, this was it. And can that be a piece of it? So it's, yeah, I see the value of the life. It's not my call. And that might always be an interesting conversation, and saying, why wouldn't it be? I don't know what the answer to that would be, but it'd be good to ask them, why wouldn't it be? And certainly, it's not, but I'm married, and I'm married. And so it is saying, all right, what is it about the life, and what are they looking for? If people are looking for religious life and saying, I'm looking to you, and that's not it. Is it that it's not the charism? Which we all listen to different calls within us. What is that? So it's, for me, I find it just listening deeply and living with some formation folks has been a great education, because they'll just say it the way it is, and you're saying, wow, is that what we look like? Is that what our priority looks like? Wow, I didn't think it was, so what is it that I need to do? Or is that a value, and you do that? So, that you started the program to do service was your goal, right? And I imagine a hope was that some people would say, you know what, I want more of this. I want to live it. That would be great to ask them questions and saying, what is that about? Or what do you see in the life? What do you?
Maria, your words have inspired and challenged us, daring us to face the threshold and compelling us to put aside fear and cross over the threshold with hope in our hearts. You called us into a reflective spirit, which gave us an experience much more retreat than academic talk, and a deep, rich conversation begun here today that will hopefully continue in our communities. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.